Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's my pleasure to welcome you also to this very important day in our education. I think we are at the crossroads of what we call the dialogue between tradition, what we have inherited, and where modernity will take us. And part of the challenge of the modernity is to revive our understanding of our own history. Medicine has a history. In Islamic civilization, we see an important aspect of intellectual engagement had been very strong interest in the well-being of a human being. And the well-being of the human being was not only a matter of spiritual development, it was also taking care of the body and the mind of the Muslims. The Prophet ﷺ, he did the same thing in his message, kept a sense of history very strong in the community, connected his mission to the past prophets of the biblical age, and connected his message to the future of the community as he saw the vision of it. And that vision is what we are fulfilling today. You and I are engaged in rediscovering not only our heritage, but what are the challenges that await us. And therefore our first panel is about medical knowledge and concepts of health in medieval Islamic history. We begin with history so that our identity becomes clearer to us, where we have come from. And the next step will be for us will be where we are about to move on. For that we have two very well-known professors who will be sharing their knowledge with us. I'm going to introduce both of them, as I will not disturb the panel as it moves on. Each speaker will address you for 20 minutes, followed by one another, and then we'll have discussion. So let me introduce then our first speaker today. It's such a short paragraph here, but I think that we say in Farsi, Mard ta sukhan na gufte bashad, aibo hunarash na hufte bashad. Until human beings speak, we don't know their value. Let us hear them, the great scholars in their own field. I introduce Peter E. Pormann. He is the professor at the University of Manchester. He teaches classics and Greco-Arabic studies. His teaching and research investigates the many historical and intellectual connections between Muslims, Jews, and Christians, writing in Greek, Latin, Hebrew, and Arabic, be it in the medieval or modern times. It's a broad agenda that he has followed in his research and writing. Our next speaker is going to be Ahmad Ragab. He is both a physician and a thinker. Professor Ragab is a physician and a scholar of science and religion. His work studies the history of science and medicine, science and religion, and the development of cultures and science and cultures of religion in the Middle East and Islamic world. He is stationed at Harvard University. He also studies various sciences and various science and religious questions in the US with a focus on Muslim communities, a very relevant issue for all of us today. Please welcome them. First, Professor Peter Pormann, and then Ahmad Ragab. Thank you.
So, once again, thanks for having me. I'm very honored to be here at this meeting because one of my interests is the history of medicine as it unfolded during the medieval period in the world of Islam, but also its continued relevance to the modern world. And I've always been keen to seek a dialogue with physicians and other health practitioners insofar as their lived experience relates or connects to that history. So nowadays we often talk about biomedicine and bioethics, and in a way create a name for the endeavor of preserving and restoring health that is different from what happened in the past. And so in this endeavor to distinguish what we're doing now from what happened in the past, we also talk about evidence-based medicine. But Martin Edwards, writing in a series of keynote keywords in the history of medicine, evidence, some years ago, said that medical practice has always been evidence-based since antiquity. What has changed is our understanding of what constitutes evidence. And that is very important. So it is not the case that the medicine of the past was not evidence-based, nor is it the case that it dealt with questions that were fundamentally different from what we are dealing nowadays. Now, to be sure, a paradigm shift occurred in the 19th and early 20th century, which makes modern medicine look completely different from what happened in the past. But some of the fundamental issues, some of the questions remain the same. And that is true in no other area like medical epistemology. So basically, the question or the science that asks the question, how do we know what treatments work? How can we find new treatments? How can we know how the body works? And how does that relate to our quest to find new remedies? Now, in order to understand what happens in the Islamic tradition from the 8th, 9th century onwards, we have to look back at the Greek heritage. And this is not because the Greeks were great or anything like that, but because this Greek heritage is a shared tradition between both the West and the East, and much that happened in the medieval Islamic world is indebted to, draws on, is based on that Greek heritage. So in my talk, I'm going to talk very briefly about two Greek figures, Hippocrates and Galen. In order to give you some background, we'll briefly explain how they were translated into Arabic, and then show you three examples from the Islamic tradition from the 10th, 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries, three examples which basically illustrate an engagement with questions of medical epistemology. And I want to give you a flavor of the debates that happened then, and hope to persuade you that actually some of the things that were debated then are of relevance to us now, and also show you that basically the medicine that was discussed in the medical manuals and in the commentary traditions that I'll show you is basically the backgrounds to most of the religious debates that we find in the medieval sources, and that are largely the basis, not solely of course, but largely the basis of many of the modern theological debates around Islam and the permissibility of certain practices. So that's why this is relevant. Now let's come to Hippocrates. Hippocrates is a bit of a figment of our imagination. There's no doubt that there was a physician called Hippocrates sometime in 5th century BC Greece, but we don't really know which works he has written. So there's something called the Hippocratic Corpus, some 60 or 70 works attributed to Hippocrates, but we don't know for certain which of these works that have his name and are transmitted under his name are actually by him. Now, within that corpus you find many different opinions, and this already shows you that they cannot have been written by the same man. So some of these works are of relevance to debates about medical epistemology, especially one which is called On Ancient Medicine, but that's a text which, for reasons I'm not going to explain here today, had very little relevance to the medieval Islamic tradition, and so I'm not going to dwell on it. But another text by him was highly relevant and much read and much commented upon, and that is the Book of Aphorisms, Kitab al-Fusul, basically a collection of pithy sayings of, well, in Arabic we would say hikam or kalim or something like that, pithy sayings that express fundamental insights into medicine, and because they were so memorable, they were learned by heart by many students and practitioners, often also the general public. And you all probably know at least the beginning of the first aphorism, which says that life is short, the art is long, opportunity fleeting, experience is treacherous, and decision is difficult. And then it goes on to say that basically the patient does not just have to pay attention to outside things, but also to the physician does not just have to pay attention to the patient, but also the outside things and those other people present. So in a way, this is like a twofold aphorism, which tells us on the one hand these 5 things, life is short, the art is long. Probably you've heard that before. And then on the other hand, it talks about the relationship between the physician, the patient, and the entourage. Now, one aspect of this aphorism in particular was debated much, and we'll come back to this later, and that is this idea that experience is difficult. So this has led to thought and interpretation about what it means to have experience and how experience can help you to find new drugs, and I'll show you some of that a little bit later. But so this first aphorism just shows you that there was somebody called Hippocrates, and he was translated into Arabic, and to that I return later. Now the other figure that is of importance is Galen of Pergamum, a physician who lives in the 2nd century AD, and he writes a treatise on medical epistemology called On the Sects for Beginners. So there are 3 sects: the rationalists, the empiricists, and the Methodists. We don't need to worry about the Methodists, which are different from the Methodist Church that you might have heard about, but the empiricists and the rationalists are described as 2 epistemological positions which work as follows. The rationalists believe that you need to need to use reason. You need to understand the inner workings of the body. You need to know how the body functions. You need to know how it works in order to be able to then come up with new drugs and test drugs and find out whether a drug works or not. So basically, you use reason. The empiricists have the opposite position. They say, no, we don't use reason. Basically, the human body is such a complex work that we cannot know its inner workings. It is hidden from us. We will never be able to understand the body as a whole. Therefore, the only thing we can do is we can observe either ourselves or use the observations of others or use analogy in order to see what works. And experience basically tells us if this drug or this treatment has worked in the past, we're going to use it again and again, but we're not going to ask why it worked in the past because it is too complicated. So basically it's a skeptical position. It's linked to a philosophical school called skepticism. Now, I give you one concrete example, rabies. If you're bitten by a rabid dog, the empiricist will say, in the past we've seen that you need to keep the wound open, clean it, apply certain cleansing drugs in order to prevent rabies from occurring. The rationalist will do exactly the same thing, but for a different reason. They will say, we know that the rabid dog has a poison called sam in Arabic, and this poison is transmitted to the patient, so we need to prevent this. I've lost. Okay. So I need to. It's just like my screen is doing strange things. So we need to prevent this poison from entering what we would call the bloodstream, basically. So they do the same thing, but once based on experience and once because of reasoning behind the functioning of the body and the occurrence of that disease. Now, Galen himself developed a position called qualified experience, in which he says certain conditions need to be met for experience to be valid. So basically he combines experience and the use of experience and reason in order to come up with treatments. And for instance, in his work on critical days, Fi Ayyam al-Buhran in Arabic, he says that experience is only valid if three conditions are met. You can't use all patients, but only those about whom there's no doubt, so that the disease occurs in them. Patient must know exactly when the crisis comes about. And in the case of prolonged crisis, one must be able to establish which day exactly is the first to be brought on by the crisis. So he says there are certain conditions which allow us then to determine when crises occur in patients. We can't just use any experience without these conditions being met. Now this idea of qualified experience is then modified, as you will see in a moment, in the Islamic tradition. Now both Galen and Hippocrates were translated into Arabic, and that happens largely in the 9th century. There's a translation movement. The main mover and shaker is a Christian, an historian Christian by the name of Hunayn ibn Ishaq. He has his nephew Hubaysh and his son Ishaq who help him, and there's a team of translators, so to speak, who render most medical and philosophical and scientific texts available at the time in Greek into Arabic. And as a result of this, basically, what we find is the emergence of a medical vocabulary, a medical language that is more or less universal, that is used by people from different backgrounds, be they Christian or Jews or Muslims, and also from different ethnic backgrounds, be they Persian or Arab or from elsewhere. So basically, Arabic emerges as a result of this translation movement as a language of science and medicine. And so things like mihna and imtahana for test, or tajriba for experience, and qiyas for reason are established terms that are used in a technical sense, and this technical language allows, or this specialist language allows, a very sophisticated medical discourse. Now my three examples. So the first person about whom I want to talk is Abu Bakr Muhammad ibn Zakaria al-Razi, and his claim, he has many claims to fame, but one of which is the use of a control group in an experiment. So basically there is a case where he's observed, he says, bitajariba, he has observed through experience how people develop brain fever if certain precursors are present, and he then says, I divided the patients into two groups. One group of patients I bloodlet, I applied phlebotomy, fast in Arabic, and another group I just left without treatment, and the people to whom I applied bloodletting basically were fine, and the others contracted brain fever, which probably is a condition akin to meningitis, although we can't just equate them. So why is this important? Because basically we see Razi using experience here, obviously qualified by reason, and he uses two groups. And this example has been known for a long time, and people have sometimes said, oh, basically Razi is the first to use controlled trials, and this has taken on a little bit of a life of its own. But it is in a very large book on medicine. It's a unique example. It's an interesting example, but we shouldn't read too much into it, although, of course, it is an interesting example. So Razi certainly makes progress in this area of medical epistemology. Now, let's turn to my second example. This is Ibn Sina, Avicenna, who lives from 980 till 1037, and he writes a massive medical encyclopedia known as the Qanun fi Tibb, and I've seen somewhere outside a copy of it, so I'm very pleased to see this book being here. It's an encyclopedia in 5 books. The first book deals with generalities, kulliyat, the second with simple drugs, the 5th with compound drugs, and the 3rd and 4th with diseases, let's say nosology, the third largely with diseases from tip to toe, so what we call topical diseases or diseases that occur in a certain part of your body. And the first topic is always baldness, because obviously you start here. And the last topic is not the toes, but it's often the reproductive organs, because these are the last kind of when you go up from up to down, where you have specific diseases and not just, let's say, general diseases, which you could have just as well on your toes as on your fingers. But and then book 4 deals with fevers and other things. So this is kind of this massive encyclopedia, and it is the most important medical text of the medieval period, and possibly of all times. You know, it was commented upon. I mean, there are like dozens and dozens and dozens of commentaries in Arabic. There are translations into Latin. It was at the basis of university medicine in Europe from the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries onward. There were at least 87 printings of the Latin version during the Renaissance in the 15th and 16th centuries. So it's of huge importance, but unfortunately not much studied. So I can just give you like one short example, because you know, life is short. Al-umru qasirun. So, and al-waqt dayiq. So, and my example is from the beginning of the second book of this canon, where he talks about simple drugs, and he talks about how can we you know, establish whether simple drugs work through experience. And he says certain conditions must be met. And obviously, I know. Don't worry. Don't worry. So certain conditions must be met, and he gives 7 conditions, you know, that need to be met basically in order for the experience to be valid. So the drug should be free from any acquired quality. The experience should be conducted on a simple illness. It should be tested on a drug and its opposite as well. The strength of the drug should correspond to the strength of the illness. The time that the drug requires to take effect should not be too long. The effect should be constant and occur in most cases. And the human body should be used for testing, not that of an animal. You know, so these are these 7 conditions. And obviously they are different from the conditions that we find in Galen, and it's a further development. And so you see, I mean, this is something which I want to show you, is there are new things in the area of medical epistemology. Now, Avicenna for the 7th, you know, like test drugs on animals, on humans, not on animals, gives 2 reasons for this. And he says, well, one is that the human body might be different so a drug might react differently in a human body from an animal body. So it might be warm in a human body, but cold for an animal body. Or the second reason is that it might have a specific quality. And he gives this example of a drug called bish, which is probably aconite. I mean, it comes from India. We can't be entirely sure. And so he says, like, it might be poisonous to humans, but some birds, starlings, might be able to eat it. So these are the reasons why you should test drugs on human, not on animals. Now, there were many, many commentaries on the canon, as I have said, and the most important, basically, well, not the most important, but one of the most famous ones is that by Ibn Anafis, and he also comments on this condition, and I just want to show you very briefly what he does. So basically, at first, you have this on the, so in the first paragraph, he basically says, he paraphrases what Avicenna says, makes a quick comment on what bish is, and that comment is actually erroneous, but I won't go into this. And then he says there could be an objection. You know, somebody might say, well, this argument about you know, human bodies are different from animal bodies, you could say the same thing about one human body from another human body. They might also differ. So one human might react differently from another human. And then he solves that conflict basically by saying, well, the same is true if we use reason, not just experience. You could make the same argument and then basically the implication is that everything would fall apart, and that makes no sense. Therefore, this objection is not valid. Now, I mean, I'm going quickly here, of course, but I just want to show you that these commentaries are an interesting place for debate and about medical epistemology, and this is just one of the many examples that one could quote. So my last example comes from Abdul Latif al-Baghdadi. He's a physician active in Syria and Egypt, and he's famous for having criticized Galenic anatomy, and he writes commentaries on the aphorisms, on the prognostic. And here we have a quotation in his commentary on the prognostics at the beginning, where he talks about medicine as the subject of medicine being a knowledge of probabilities. And Abdul Latif al-Baghdadi is very interesting in that he tries to quantify the uncertainty of medicine. He once compares it to archery. At another time, he compares it to trying to establish irrational numbers, such as pi, for instance, or the square root of 10. You can calculate till the cows come home. You will never, ever get to the last digit, if you see what I mean. And like that, medicine also can only have approximation. And in his commentary on the aphorisms, he makes the same point. I mean, so basically, there's an aphorism 219, which says to determine before in the course of acute diseases whether it is death or health is not entirely trustworthy. And when commenting on this, he says, well, you know, like in the case of acute diseases, we can't be absolutely certain. We can only, the only thing that we can try to do is that if you are an intelligent physician, you will err only rarely and basically get it right most of the time. So he talks about probabilities, and that too, from an epistemological point of view, is very, very interesting. Now, I come to the end of my talk, and I basically just want to draw a few conclusions. So what I try to show you is that on the one hand, there are debates that started in the Greek world that continue in the Arabic tradition. There's a relevance of Hippocrates and Galen for what happens in the medieval Arab world. But this is not a story of you know, just transmission of knowledge. You could say knuckle, basically repeating what the Greeks have said. But we find innovations, and I've given you 3 examples of where discussions are pushed forward in the area of medical epistemology. You know, you use experience to modify treatments. You find new conditions that attach to testing drugs, or you reflect on medicine as being the knowledge of probability. So basically, you offer that reflection, which sounds very, very modern. Now, importantly, a lot of that discourse happens in commentaries. You know, so it happens in commentaries not just on Hippocratic works such as the Prognostic and the Aphorisms, but it also happens in commentaries on texts like the Canon of Avicenna. And when we look at the vast Arabic tradition that exists, we see that most texts, most of these commentaries on Avicenna's canon, for instance, have never been edited, have never been studied. They remain in manuscripts. Nobody has touched them. There are no studies on them. I mean, there are some studies on a few, but the vast majority, basically, it's like an ocean out there. And we just, as historians of medicine, as textual scholars, have not taken up the challenge to edit this massive amount of text. And so this is something which obviously we can only hope to do in the future. And therefore, what I've shown you is that we have islands of knowledge in a sea of ignorance. Thank you very much indeed.